First, I would like to remark that it's really in fact, an enormous pleasure to discuss Jo's book, because the book represents, among else, because the book represents an achievement in clarifying to philosophers their possible role in public policy, as well as in clarifying to other participants the possible role of philosophers in the process of policy making. I applaud Jo's clarity in explaining the practical unusableness and unsuitableness for engagement in public policy of frequent approaches to public policy, that is, that of systematizing ethics and political theories in systems where reasoning simply proceeds from general principles of philosophical constructions to particular conclusions. This kind of approach has proved to be unsuccessful because of the inability of the participants to offer a theory able to be widely endorsed. Disagreements about these systematic theories are persistent. Philosophers who rely on their, although philosophers who rely on their systematic theories are not worried by this, and they frequently rebut the rejections by saying that these rejections are based on irrational intuitions, relicts of the past, prejudices, like, for example, even evolutionary relicts of the past, like, for example, Peter Singer does. So, from this aspect, I think that Jo's contribution is really precious. As it is clear, such philosophers privilege truth or objectivity over consensus, and this is, in Jo's view, their basic mistake. As he repeatedly says, the primary goal in a public debate is not to realize truth. Now, I quote, "In the public policy arena, there seems little to be gained by asking whether values are objective or subjective. If we can achieve intersubjective agreement, then we have all we can reasonably hope for." Unquote. This intersubjective agreement is, however, is not, in my opinion, only a matter of bargaining, and I can't see the philosopher as engaging it as a mere negotiator or mediator. After all, I think there would be much better people for playing the roles of negotiators or mediators than philosophers are. So think about trained policemen, for example, like Kevin Spacey in the Negotiator film. Or even politicians, very important film for me, because once my wife told me that I resemble her very much, Kevin Spacey in this film. Think about politicians by themselves. I think that philosophers can only disturb them in their process of bargaining because of their usual habits. One is the habit remarked by Jo in his book, the habit of disagreeing, habit that also appears evident in this conference, but yesterday Snježana, the main objection to Snježana's paper was, well, it is not controversial. And also today we saw the discussion when David has a comment and then Chandra David, well, in fact, I thought something similar, but it's not really similar, and so this is the habits of philosopher. Then there are other habits not remarked by Jo in his book, but speaking frankly, an aspect of academic egocentrism very frequent among philosophers, like among other academics, which certainly renders more difficult participating in a process of bargaining. And then something I would call deontologism, which is also a feature in this sense shared by consequentialists, that is, this really strong attitude that what's correct must be totally realized. So from this standpoint, even people like Peter Singer and John Harris, who are consequentialists, this aspect in fact are deontologists. So the philosopher I can't see as a mere negotiator or mediator, and in my opinion he must be, or he or she must be engaged in the affirmation of values as well. And it seems to me that although he is very careful of advising the philosopher not to employ his or her controversial values, Joe himself is in various parts of the book careful in relation to his own values as well. And these are mainly values related to an egalitarian liberal conception of justice, as it appears in some of the chapters of the book. However, in coherence with his suggestion of the proper behavior of the philosopher engaged in public policy, Joe does not simply apply an egalitarian liberal theory of justice to issues of public policy. So, for example, as also he did today in his proceed, he indicates the inappropriateness of taking Mill's harm to others principle as the only proper reason for interfering with people's obligations. Joe's approach seems in conformity with public reason liberalisms. So this is my first maybe controversial interpretative point. That is, liberalisms that find the legitimacy of the law in the fact that each and every person has a justification for it. The resonance of public reason liberalism is visible in Joe's words because he explicitly refers to some of the key concepts of the leading public reason liberal, obviously John Rawls. Whether a moral view, now I quote, whether a moral view is correct or right or persuasive takes second place to whether it is widely shared or at least widely accepted in the sense of enough people being prepared to live with it. This is not to endorse any form of subjectivism or relativism, but rather to accept the practical implications of what Rawls called the burdens of judgment. That given the free use of reason, conscientious, reasonable, moral thinkers may come to differing and conflicting judgments. Unquote. Together with making use of Rawls' concept of burdens of judgment, Joe uses another fundamental concept used by Rawls, that of overlapping consensus. Although Joe does not simply acquire Rawls' concept of overlapping consensus, but rather proposes something analogous to it. I described briefly the method that Joe applies in order to compare it to Rawls' overlapping consensus, and then in order to show some problems that I think are shared. The method analogous to Rawls' overlapping consensus put forward by Joe consists in showing that a particular policy is defensible, quote, in conflicting moral assumptions, unquote. So in a simple example, Joe says that Kantians and utilitarians can both condemn murder of innocent people. This appears in the introduction. But in the same page of the introduction, things are more complicated than it appears from this simple example. The method analogous to Rawls' overlapping consensus put forward by Joe includes shared values and features commonly taken as morally relevant that are employed in considerations in the justification of laws and public norms. For example, in the first chapter, in the discussion of scientific research on animals, Joe takes in consideration the capacity to suffer, what constitutes the good for a creature, social capacities, and cognitive development. Now, as it is obvious also from previous discussions, this is only analogous to Rawls' use of the concept of overlapping consensus, and maybe even not really analogous. Overlapping consensus for Rawls is represented by the possibility of various doctrines to be consistent with the conception of justice, like Rawls' justice of fairness, or a family of conceptions of justice. Precisely, this is very well known, the liberal family of conceptions of justice, characterized by first a system of liberties and rights, second the primacy of this system of liberties and rights, and third, all citizens have the resources needed in order to use these freedoms. Importantly, however, in Rawls' view, the main justification of the liberal conception of justice is not represented by the convergence of various doctrines, but by a freestanding argument. That is, the justification that participants offer to each other, precisely participants that approach each other as being equals with intention to establish a stable, fair system of cooperation, and who endorse the ideals of burdens of judgment and reasonable pluralism. Convergence between various doctrines, that is, overlapping consensus, is needed for full justification, but the basic justification derives from the freestanding argument. An important analogy between Jo's and Rawls' proposal is that, as Jo says, quote, we start from where we are, unquote. In some sense, this is Rawls' position as well, but Rawls' theory of justice is an idealization, although it is an idealization based on, as Rawlsians repeatedly say, very important values that we share. The shared commitments on which Rawls bases his theory are an abstraction, and part of his enterprise is to bracket a wide part of what many people endorse and to exclude these from considerations of justice. Now, although Jo refers to the convergence of two main doctrines in overlapping consensus in the introduction, utilitarianism, Kantianism, and the moral principle that protects life, and he relies on justification based on various principles and values as well. It might appear that he applies a bracketing as well. That is, that he excludes, for example, religious comprehensive doctrines as legitimate and equal participants in public justification. Now there is a quotation that maybe suggests this, but as I will show later, it doesn't necessarily show an attitude of bracketing. The quotation is this, quote, yet it is one thing to say that those who accept a particular religious view should also accept prohibitions on gambling, and quite another to say that the prohibitions should be enforced by government against everyone, whatever their faith or private beliefs. To press this latter argument conflicts with the basic premise of liberal political philosophy. Now, independent of bracketing religious, it seems to me that in many events Jo excludes controversial philosophical doctrines, as for example appeared also today earlier in the discussion, at least I interpret it so. It seems that Jo accepts as legitimate standards of the justification that can be endorsed by a family of liberal conception of justice, that is something like Rawls' standards of public justification of norms based on what Rawls characterizes as liberal, and together with this, Jo includes considerations not particularly related to liberal conception of justice, but widely shared and strongly endorsed, like the legitimacy of intervening in order to protect people from some harms that they cause to themselves, as for example is visible in the chapters on gambling and drugs, as well as some privileged position of the status quo. I think that such considerations can be taken as legitimate by public reason liberals engaged in less idealized theories of justice than Rawls, like for example the one put forward by Gerald Gauss. Now, the Rawlsian characterization of public justification is not without problems, and I show them because it seems to me that they may be partly shared by Jo's proposal. The main problem is whether it is legitimate to ground public justification on shared values while excluding specific doctrines or views. The issue is particularly relevant when framed, as Gauss does, as a kind of internal criticism. So, as Gauss says, the assumption of a public justification based on shared premises is disrespectful of the assumption of reasonable pluralism, because it excludes some bona fide intelligible standards of justification, and as such represents a partisan perspective that illegitimately excludes many people and worldviews from the moral and legal constituents. For example, a religious person can react to the prohibition to use animals for scientific experiments, because his religion denies any moral status to animals, but supports a strong duty to help human beings. Or think about the Muslim and the Methodist, as well as other followers of early Christian doctrines, in Joe's discussion of gambling. In any event, as appeared to make today, Joe clearly excludes controversial philosophical doctrines as part of the justification, say, premises. But why are these considerations excluded as possible valid reasons in a process of justification of public norms? In Joe's proposal, can it be only for the sake of agreement? Because agreement, as we see, is very important in Joe's book. But I think it can't be only for agreement, because this would be strongly discriminative of some people. I mean, people for whom these controversial doctrines are very important. There must be a principled reason as well. It seems to me that this is an important challenge to Joe's proposal as well as to Rawls' proposal. Maybe it can even be the case that the problem is more pressing for Joe than it is for Rawls. As I have already said, the basic justification for Rawls is freestanding. That is, it is justification appropriate to participants that approach each other as free and equals with the ideal of society as a fair system of cooperation, who accept the idea of burdens of judgment and reasonable pluralism. Full justification for Rawls is obtained only if the conception of justice that results from the freestanding argument can be the focus of overlapping consensus. That is, it is compatible with various comprehensive doctrines endorsed by citizens. But the conception as derived from the freestanding argument is in some sense basic, and it puts pressure on the comprehensive doctrines for modifications in the process of reflective equilibrium. Probably, as it seems to me, Jonathan Cohn convincingly argues, the freestanding argument is possible for Rawls because he is engaged in putting forward an ideal theory, something that he qualifies as a realistic utopia. This is something that gives support to the idealization in the model of public justification that he offers. Joe, on the other hand, is engaged in a more realistic enterprise, maybe even not more realistic, but totally realistic, that of contributing to public policy here and now for people like they are here and now. This renders more difficult for him to rely on something like a freestanding argument, and there is pressure to rely on overlapping consensus only. But then it appears the question why some doctrines, like religious and philosophical doctrines, are excluded as constraints in the process of justification. It appears more appropriate to rely, in this case, for Joe, not on the consensus shared premises view of Rawls' concept of public reason, but on Gauss' concept of public reason based on the convergence of all intelligible standards of justification. But perhaps I have misrepresented Joe's proposal until this part of the paper. I hope not right to the end of the paper. Perhaps Joe does not exclude as considerations relevant for public justification religious doctrines, and is less exclusive of philosophical views as well. But he employs Gauss' convergence model of public reason and something like his Gauss asymmetry principle. So in this interpretation, the asymmetry principle, according to which religious and philosophical doctrines are not valid reasons to require coercion, but are valid reasons to resist coercion. And maybe we must interpret in the light of this asymmetry principle, the quotation on gambling and the religious attitudes toward them. In such an interpretation, the religious person that appeals to her religion in order not to be limited in her scientific research on animals is in a better position than the religious person who appeals to her religion in order to require prohibition of gambling. This, however, opens a different kind of problems related to the egalitarian side of Jo's conception of justice, the one that appears in his discussion of health and disability. There are members of societies who endorse worldviews opposed to egalitarianism, and therefore enforcing egalitarian views can be a form of illegitimate oppression for them, like Gauss says. In any event, Gauss' public reason model, the convergence model, is opposed to Jo's intentions, because Jo's intention is to arrive to laws. So an agreement on a law is, how to say, the main inspiration of the book. While Gauss supports a very reduced state, and such reduced that Gauss needs to dedicate some energy to distinguish his view from libertarianism. In brief, and in conclusion, Gauss' objection to Rawls of inappropriately excluding some people from the constituency appears to be a challenge to Jo's enterprise as well, and it puts pressure to either give a strong legitimacy to religious and philosophical doctrines to be an equal participant in public justification even when they require coercion, or to accept the requirements of non-egalitarian conceptions of justice when they judge egalitarian public policies as illegitimately coercive, or more generally a state with very reduced functions like in Gauss' proposal.